So now in Islam, there's a tremendous emphasis on Christ's doctrines as well. And there isn't any evidence that Christ himself took part in, let's say, wars.
Okay,
and so
I disagree with
it's
that.
hard.
And let me disagree with that.
What do you mean?
Okay, well, if you analyze Christ as an archetype, when he comes back in his second coming, he is going to dominate the world. And one can say, well, that's not the historical Christ. But when we're looking at him in the way that you look at,
look, that's a reasonable objection.
If we look
and
at
I understand that a judge has that martial element, and I don't think it's reasonable to use the archetypal representation as an argument against the historical reality. And look, I'm not saying to you that I know that what Muhammad did was wrong. That isn't what I'm saying. I'm saying that I don't understand how participation in those defensive wars, let's say, but then that was also followed by a tremendous explosion of Islamic expansion, right? The biggest empire the world had ever seen in a very short period of time, right at Europe's doors.
Mm-hmm.
And that was also followed by the severance of the Islamic faith into two major categories and internecine conflict there. Yeah. And so there's that stream of armed conflict activity.
I think that you're, with respect, I don't think you're getting the history fully right here. Because
that's fine. Go right ahead.
The war in Jamal and Siffin, the wars between Shia and Sunnah, or what would then be, it's not really between Shia and Sunnah, because quite frankly, Shiaism had not been established as but the wars of the companions. How many people died in those wars? Do we have any numbers? For maximum, we can say.
Fair enough, man. And it's not like Christianity hasn't been rife with internecine conflict.
Yes. No, but the thing is...
But the fact is that it was almost immediately after Muhammad's death that this fracturing took place among the people that were closely allied with him. And it was a bloody fracturing. And it isn't obvious that it's been rectified.
How bloody was it? How bloody was it?
How bloody does it have to be? It doesn't take much...
Okay. Well, Jordan, let's be honest. Let's be fair.
Okay.
Let's be fair, right? With the wars that took place 30 to 40 years, and it wasn't immediately after, because you said that in a video, the day he died. That's wrong. It didn't happen the day he died. It happened 30 to 40 years after. It happened 30 to 40 years after. And
how many members of Muhammad's immediate family survived during that 30 years? My understanding was that most of his immediate family died in armed conflict.
Most of his immediate family died in his own lifetime.
Yes, well, I'm not speaking of them, but I'm speaking of what happened after he died.
Let's get these facts right, because...
Yeah.
Okay, look. First fact. Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we say sallallahu alaihi wasallam meaning peace and blessing be upon him. All of his children died in his life, okay, except for one. So most of the members of his immediate family, and his wife died, Khadija died, his uncle Abu Talib died, his other uncle Hamza died. They all died within his lifetime, either due to illness or due to some other cause, war, for example. Like one of the defensive wars, Hamza died. And by the way, Muhammad forgave his killer. And that's something which goes against the warlord thesis. Because when he then conquered Mecca, it was actually no fighting. I'm not sure if you know this. It's called Fath Mecca. When he went into and conquered Mecca, he didn't fight anybody. It was no fighting. There were a few people that were exempted, but he actually quoted what Joseph quoted to his brothers in the Quran, which is "La tathriba alaykum al-yawm," that no blame is on you today. And this, by the way, is a bedrock example of forgiveness in Islam, because these were people that were persecuting him for 13 years. These are people that killed his uncle. Like I said, there's one person called Wahshi who literally killed his uncle and mutilated his body. And he said to Wahshi, I forgive you, but I can't see your face because of how he said, ممكن تغيب عني وجهك وجهك عني. He said, can you keep your face away from me, because psychologically I can't bring my face, but I do forgive you, he said. So he forgave people that killed his own family members. And this was after he himself attempted a treaty with the pagans called Hudaybiyah. And so they broke the treaty, and that's what initiated the conquest of Mecca, which was not a conquest that was fighting. Now, if you compare this, because I think the comparison, if there's any comparison that can be or should be made, it's Jesus' second coming with Muhammad in the Medinan period, not in the Meccan period. In the Meccan period, both were being persecuted, Jesus in his life and Muhammad in his in the Meccan period. But Jesus, when he comes back, he will then get authority, and he will be ruling with the iron scepter, according to the Bible. He will be crushing his enemies, as it says in Corinthians, under his foot, humbling his enemies under his foot, and killing and violent stuff. So, in fact, I will actually argue today that the New Testament representation of Jesus Christ in his second coming is way more violent than Muhammad's conquests in the Medinan period.
Okay, well, look, like I said, I wasn't trying to make the case. I wasn't trying to make the case that what happened in Mecca or Medina was wrong. So let me explain that a little bit. So Christian Europe fought a defensive war against the Nazis. It isn't obvious that that was wrong.
I don't think that was, I wouldn't say that's defensive.
Well, okay, fine. But I understand the concept of defensive war. And,
well, when America got involved in World War II, it was not under immediate threat by Germany, and they colonized it. And here's the thing, it overtook Western Germany, you see. And here's the thing, the term warlord that you use with the Prophet, you've never used with Harry Truman, you've never used with Roosevelt, you've never used with Winston Churchill, all of which conquered countries, literally, in wars. Because I feel like there is a bias there, and you've actually never used it with anybody else aside from the Prophet Muhammad in your public output. And I think that's unjustifiable. I think that you have biblical prophets like Moses, you have biblical prophets like Joshua, you have the Jesus in his second coming, all of which were warrior prophets, and you've only used the term warlord with the Prophet Muhammad, and I think that is unjustifiable. I think if what is it that what makes someone a warlord then? If it's conquering lands, then Harry Truman is a warlord. Then and so on and so forth. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad.
Well, I guess that's a real tough question, isn't it? What makes a warlord and what makes a just war? It's not like any of us have the precise answers to that. I think that's partly what we're trying to hash out right here.
There are definitions of the word warlords. The definition of the word warlord, according to Collins, is that someone who acquires force by aggressivity and violence.
Well, okay, so fine, you pushed back on me, so I'll push back on you to some degree.
Okay.
Well, it's certainly the case that the expansion of the Islamic Empire was accomplished by a tremendous amount of warlike activity, and that wasn't defensive. Now, look, I understand that monotheism is a difficult state to attain, and that monotheistic societies have emerged in the midst of conflict throughout human society. I understand that, and I'm not even saying that there's something exceptional in that regard about Islam, although the rate at which it happened was quite remarkable. But it presents us with a problem, doesn't it? I mean, it presents everyone with a problem. And the problem is, well, for example, the problem is reconciling the idea of turning the other cheek with the idea of a just war, a defensive war, or an expansive war for that matter. And of course that issue is relevant to Islam because Islam exploded outward and produced the biggest empire the world had ever seen in the space of a few short centuries.
Yeah, but Dr. Jordan Peterson.
So then you ask, well, what's the spirit? What is the spirit that animated that? And is that attributable to the Islamic doctrines themselves? Yes, I don't know the answer to that.
No, let me tell you the answer to that, okay? And this is what I want to tell you conclusively, and this will help build bridges, honestly. Because we can maintain the warlord thesis, we can maintain the expansionist thesis. But here's what I'll tell you. Islam has a capability to be expansive, and it also has a capability of making peace treaties. And it does, and it should do whatever's in its best interest. Just like every country should do whatever's in its best interest. In the pre-modern world, we did not, I think this is highly anachronistic. In the pre-modern world, there was no such thing as the UN. It was a realist international relations framework whereby everybody was fighting everyone. The Roman Empire didn't care about it didn't care about you, quite frankly. It was expanding itself. The Persian Empire was expanding itself. And the Arabian Peninsula was in between both. And so it could have either been swallowed by those two other empires, or it could decide to, in fact, we will impose our governments on them before they impose it on us. And it decided the former rather than the latter. It decided to expand. And in fact, the Prophet, in his weakest of times, he predicted that would happen. You know, there was one war in particular where they were starving, and it's called Khandaq. And he hit a rock and he said, Futihat Rum, the Roman Empire has been conquered. He hit a rock again. He said, Futihat Faris, that the Persian Empire has been conquered. And then he knocked the rock again. He said this in his weakest moment. He said that the Yemen has been conquered. I see that the expansion of the Islamic Empire is a proof for Islam. And you know, it's not just me. Even historians say this. Barnaby Rogerson, he said the fact that Islam spread to the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire is equivalent to is equivalent to Eskimos taking over Russia and America. I believe it's miraculous, if anything, that this happened. I don't think it's unjustifiable. I think actually, Jordan Peterson, to be
then
completely
why
honest
did
with
it
you,
stop at Europe's borders, so to speak? If it was a miraculous expansion,
yeah, it stopped out because of it wasn't successful there. It wasn't. It stopped where it couldn't go further. But the point is that it's not like the Christians at that time in Rome cared. I mean, they did the same thing for years. They were expanding themselves.
Well, that's why I said I wasn't making a prima facie case that this was wrong. I'm trying to understand it. And you objected to my use of the term warlord, and perhaps rightly so. You know, perhaps that was an injudicious comment. I was rather shocked when I was reading Islamic history when I encountered the degree of violence that surrounded these events. And so, you know, maybe I was
I appreciate what you said there. I think that shows real sincerity, and it's one step closer to creating real meaningful relationships between
I think and I think your defense that, well, the world was a battleground of empires, and you know, if it's pushed out from our territory or being encroached upon and dominated, then it isn't obvious that being encroached upon and dominated is the right approach, the correct approach, the most moral approach, let's say, especially because there'd be no shortage of bloodshed that would also accompany that. Mm-hmm. So sometimes you're in a bad place, but you know, it's not an easy thing for any of us to, what would you say, mediate between doctrines like turn the other cheek and love your enemy, and also at the same time discuss the necessity of both defensive and sometimes expansionist wars, right? We all have to contend with that. And it's very difficult to contend with it. The arguments are extremely complicated.
You're absolutely right. And I think what's really important here, because I think this is a huge misconception, is to outline, because I know you're against totalitarianism. You're very, vocal about that. And I want to tell you that we are also, a point of commonality. We are also against totalitarianism. If we define totalitarianism as a central government trying to encroach every private and public matter of the citizens' lives. And this is something we don't believe in. In fact, this is very important. Islam does not say you have to force people either to become Muslim or that they have to live an Islamic lifestyle within an Islamic governance. And I'm not sure if you know this, but at the time of the Prophet, he made a constitution, okay, with Jewish people, with other people who are not Muslim at the time, protecting their rights to worship whoever they wanted to worship, and actually even guaranteeing that if there were intruder forces, that they will be protected like that as well.
Is that the arrangement made with like fellow people of the book, essentially?
Yes, it was the arrangement.
Yeah, I'm aware of that.
Yes, and so not only this, but this was implemented at the time of the caliphs. So Umar ibn Khattab, or Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and so on. We believe in a kind of pluralism in this sense. And in fact, I would argue that it was more legally efficacious than what we have in the West. Do you know why? Because permission was...
Do you think that's true now?
Yes, even, let me tell you why. Because Christians were given courts that they could rule in, and that the law would be efficacious. It would be a parallel dissenting law system which would have effect. So they would effectively be able to go and judge their affairs outside of the general framework of Islam. And in fact, this is in the Quran. فَلْيَحْكُمْ أَهْلُ الْإِنْجِيلِ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فِيهِ. And they took this, even though we believe that the Torah has been corrupted to some extent, the remnants of, they can use the Torah, whatever corrupted version they have, to rule their affairs. And this is something that was done at the time of the Prophet, done at the time of the caliphs. And so even now we would say, and I'm not saying that the whole of Islamic history has presented this convivencia that we saw in Spain between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, a good time, or other times in India.
By all, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. Of course, I'm not. But what I'm saying is that I think it is disingenuous to point at Islam as if it's been the most intolerant of all of these religions. Look at the Alhambra. Look at the Spanish Inquisition. Look at the Crusades. Look at the colonialism that has happened in the name, if not in the name of religion,
there's no disputing with me the fact that in some sense we all have the blood of history on our hands.
Yes.
I'm firmly aware of that. And
No, that's what I'm
it's
saying.
an existential burden for everyone. And I'm not trying to make the case that this is particularly or uniquely true of Islam. I certainly know that that's not the case. What I'm saying instead is that these are things that we have to contend with, and we don't exactly know how. Right? You still have the problem of these two evangelizing religions, right?
Okay.
That are going head to head in some sense.
Yes, it's true. Evangelizing doesn't mean that it's compelling, and this is very clear.
Well, okay. Now there's an interesting point. Not that the points you made before aren't, because I kind of think, well, let he who can tell the best story win. And then that story also has the best actors, so to speak, right? And so I would say the proper mode to conversion is something like shining example. And then if you're governed by a doctrine that is in fact divine, and you're managing to embody that in the sense that gives you the glow, the charismatic glow of embodied divinity, 2 steps removed, let's say, and people are willing to abide by your words as a consequence, well, more power to you. And that's a lot more efficient and effective than compulsory war, armed conflict, or any of those things. And I mean, this is a constant problem. And I would also say that given our technological mastery now, we really can't afford this anymore. We have to solve this problem of defensive war, expansive war, evangelical religion, how to go about uniting us under some umbrella that isn't so vague that it means nothing, how to preserve our traditions from the past. And I can't see any better way than each of us trying to be shining exemplars of our tradition, and then letting that goodness shine forth in a way that people, it may be the case that we'll find that the better we are, the more we're like each other. I mean, wouldn't that be a kind of union under something approximating God? That all good men could see in each other a reflection of something that was the highest? And that should be compelling in and of itself?
Absolutely. But I think in terms of the jurisprudence, in terms of what Islam is capable of, people in the West must realize that Islam is fully capable of peace. This is what must be realized. How do we know that? It's not despite the Quran and the Sunnah or the sayings of the Prophet and the actions, but it's because of them. If you look at the Quran and you look at, for example, chapter 4 verse 90, or if you look at, for example, chapter 1 verse 90, chapter 2 verse 190, you'll see that the Islamic commandments are clearly sometimes about defensiveness, but sometimes also clearly about creating peace treaties. And this Treaty of Hudaybiyah is a bedrock example. So long as there's peace treaties, there is peace. And so in terms of Muslim countries, they can perpetually create peace treaties with other people. Muslim people, even more so, because we believe we're fully under contract. And therefore...
So you're willing to abide by a contract?
This is the thing. Let me tell you something, Jordan Peterson, okay? One of the clearest for me, and I've done a lot of work studying liberalism, studying Christianity, and studying Islam, okay? The clearest commonality between liberal theory and Islam is contractarianism and contracts, consent. That is the clearest thing, because in liberal theory, you have the theory of consent. And in Islam, you have the same thing. Contracts are binding. The Quran says, "Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu."
Even with people outside the faith?
Yes, especially with people outside the faith.
Why especially? Is that part of the tradition of hospitality in some sense?
Yes, because if you break a contract with a non-Muslim, then you're driving them away from Islam. Okay, so
yes, that's definitely true. That's absolutely
and so remember,
true.
Islam is attempts to attract people to its own religion. One of the categories of zakat was وَالْمُؤَلَّفَةِ قُلُوبُهُم, money that you pay to non-Muslims so that they can feel comfortable and they can feel as if you're doing them a favor and there's relationships going on. It's a category. It is a category of zakat, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, to give such money. So the fact that Islam states in chapter 5 verse 1, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu awfu bil uqud, in chapter the Quran, O you who believe, fulfill your contracts. That is generic. Al-Muslimuna ala shurutihim.
That means to abide by your word. So
you have to stick by your words. No matter, for us, if you don't stick to your words, then this shows a lack of character. It shows that in fact, one of the signs of a hypocrite is that he goes against a religious hypocrite. Is that he either if he makes a contract, he goes against it. It seems one of the most despicable things.
Do you think that there are other things that I've said about Islam that we could talk about right now that I could clear up? And, you know, because I don't want elephants under the carpet. I don't like elephants under the carpet or snakes under the carpet. So are there other things that I've said that that people on the Islamic side who would maybe like to not be my enemy, let's say, because who needs enemies after all, unless you want them? Are there other things that you think, places that I've misstepped in a serious manner that should be rectified as far as you're concerned?
In a serious matter, I will confine it to the warlord comment, because I think that's the one that most Muslims...
Well, you know, people in the West are afraid of Islamic expansionism, and they're, okay, so let's go after that again. So the other thing that I find upsetting, let's say, is the civil war in Islam.
The Prophet didn't tell people to fight each other. I mean, that
fair enough.
Islam doesn't say that. Islam doesn't say there should be a civil war. In fact, it was predicted, but it was never encouraged. In fact, the Quran clearly encourages against civil war.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing about Christianity in relationship to the endless Protestant and Catholic wars.
Sorry, just to interrupt. It gives us a remedy. In fact, the Quran is the only religious book I know that tells you how to deal with a civil war. وإن طائفتان من المؤمنين قتتلوا فأصلحوا بينهما. It says that if two groups of Muslims fight, then create peace between them. فإن بغت إحداهما على الأخرى فقاتلوا التي تبغي حتى تفيء إلى أمر الله. It says that if one of the groups rebels against the other group, then fight the one that is rebellious until it wakes up to the command of God. So Islam is categorically against civil war. Islam is clearly for pluralism. It's not for compulsion. These misnomers and misconceptions must...
So fair enough. And as I said, I know that the Protestants and the Catholics were at each other's throats for years. And despite the fact of there being no justification for that, let's say, or quite the contrary in the Gospels. So this isn't a problem that's unique to Islam, but it is an ongoing problem in Islam. And it's not like there isn't sectarian strife in the West. I also understand that. And so that makes people watching the religious community, say, wary because, well, for obvious reasons. And so I know you can't answer this question in totality, but Islam hasn't been able to bring its own house into unified order. And so why do you think that is? And how is that related to Islam itself, if it is at all?
There's nothing exceptional about Islam in that regard. And this, once again, is you made this point many times, and I'll tell you something again. Just because there's multiple interpretations of something, it doesn't mean that that thing is false. Like there may be multiple interpretations of the killing of JFK. It doesn't mean that JFK didn't get killed. People differ on things which, especially if there's a lot of those people, which there can be more than one interpretation about. Now, in terms of body count, there was actually a book that was written. And there was a chapter of the book by, I think his name is Nazir Sheikh. And he done a study looking at the numbers of people that have been killed in all the major world religions. And he puts Christianity firmly at the top. I mean, this doesn't require too much historical research anyway. Look at the 30-year war. Compare that with any war.
Look,
any war in Islam.
Okay. So the point you're making, the point you're making is twofold. It's not... The necessity for civil war isn't embedded in the doctrine. Yes. And there's no reason to throw stones at the Muslim world when we could perfectly well look to our own history. Exactly. And I do think what we should do is look to our own history. I really believe that. And I believe that we all carry historical guilt for the bloodshed that's preceded the structure of all of our societies. But we, in the West, we look at the Muslim world and we see that it's riven apart. And we wonder, well... I know there's a hypocritical element to that. I'm not claiming that there isn't. It's not like we have our own house in order, but
you have to remember something else. You have to remember there was a colonial reality that existed where Britain, France, and many of the European countries and the Western European extensions, they dominated the Muslim world for the last 200-300 years. And so,
but I don't think that's particularly good argument.
No, it's very good argument.
Well, hang on a sec. I don't want to knock it away completely. The rift that I'm talking about, though, was evident far before that. Now, the fact of that colonial complication, that could well be. The fact of that colonial complication could well be a contributor. I know the nation state lines, first of all, were imposed. They were imposed quickly. They were imposed arbitrarily and partly that was a consequence of, what would you say, having to do a lot of things very quickly in the aftermath of a terrible war. I'm not trying to excuse it, but it was complicated. And I know that that's left the Middle East in this, group of nation states that now comprise the world in a very complicated situation. So it's a reasonable point, but the rift was there before. And so...
Well, okay, here's what I'll say to that, yeah? You're right to say that there was arbitrary lines that were drawn, but it's not just that there were arbitrary lines that were drawn. You mentioned the Middle East. Syria, for example, which is where most of the problems are happening now, in terms of the Middle Eastern countries, is probably number one. Maybe Libya number two. But say Syria, for example, they put 3, 4, 5, 10 different factions, all of which have differing understandings of religion, of ideology, of whatever it may be, together. That produced wars. You had Christians in Lebanon fighting Sunnis, Shias fighting Sunnis, and this happened especially after the revolution. A lot of it is political
so it was
factors.
The imposition of a false unity. That's really what happened.
If you look at what they're doing now, like look at Lebanon as an example. You have to have a Christian president and a Sunni prime minister and a Shiite, I don't know what it is, first minister or something. I mean, they have systems that try and mitigate these issues, but it's a mess because you're putting people that have different visions of how to run a country together, and there's similar demographics. It's like 30%, 40%, 20%, and so that creates more wars. But they put them together almost I would argue on purpose, to be honest. It's divide and conquer.
If you look at countries like Denmark and Sweden and Norway, which are very peaceful and very prosperous, they're also very homogenous. And they're relatively small. So the problem of governance over diversity is much reduced in countries like that. It's simpler for them to be at peace because the culture is relatively homogenous. And so I take your point. It's not easy to bring a true diversity into something approximating a unity, especially when that unity has been, in some sense, arbitrarily imposed and also rapidly and arbitrarily imposed. So that's a reasonable point.
Yeah. But I think what it is, and I've seen this in your reading list, it's like when you follow kind of Bernard Lewis's or Samuel Huntington's kind of Clash of Civilization narratives, sometimes you miss the nuances, and these are the nuances.
Yeah, well, that's for sure.
There are myriad contributory factors to why, and I still don't see how Islamic countries, there's like almost 50 Muslim majority countries.